Hello friends, this is Jessie James Beads. My name is Jem and today we're working with some beautiful Czech glass beads. Let's take a look at what we're going to work with. I thought it would be fun today to use those beautiful Czech glass beads alongside something that you don't normally see used in this fashion. Now these are 3-hole spacers and these are encrusted with rhinestones, so lots of sparkle. And normally you'd have a strand of 3 beads, perhaps across the back of the wrist in a bracelet of some description, or even being used as a choker. But today we're going to use them to space out a drop earring design. So we're going to need some earring findings. You'll need 2 3-hole jewel encrusted spacers. I'm going to work with single beads, so I have got one of the smaller frosty and clear beautiful Czech glass in blue, and then the unicorn in the medium size. Again, you've got frosts and polish, and then one of those large in that gorgeous bottle green colourway. I've also found some scraps of chain, so these are just over 1 inch long each. They don't have to be that long, it's just a really nice way to add some dynamism to your designs. I'm also going to be using some 3mm round silver colour metal spacer beads and a handful of crimps and crimp covers. I've also got my handy bead stoppers just in case things get feisty. So we're going to be working with Beadalon 19 strand. I've got gold satin, I think it's called here. And you're going to need one slightly longer length of around about 10 inches and one slightly shorter length of around about 6 or so inches. So I've just got some scraps from my desk. It doesn't really matter, but I would say as long as your longer piece is around the 10 inches, you're going to be able to work with this project. So the idea behind this is that we just add a little bit of dangly dynamism down at the base with the chain scraps. You don't have to add that if you don't want to, but we're going to utilise these 3-hole spacer bars in a slightly different way. We're going to build from the top of the earring down. So what I tend to do is grab myself a clasp just to help me get this part going. So to begin with, I'm just going to run the longer length of that 19 strand beading material. This is around about a 10-inch length, and I'm just going to fold it in half just into that clasp. It just helps make things a little bit easier to work with. I'm then going to grab a tube style crimp. If you prefer to use a round crimp, then please feel free to do so, as long as you're able to pop a crimp cover on it afterwards. Now when you're making earrings, it really does pay to make sure that the loop you've created at the top here is the same on both pieces. As they're being worn on the other side of the head, a little difference won't really matter. The main thing is that we're going to be able to trim away the end of that extra piece of beading material up at the top, so you can hold on to that with your fingers. So I'm just going to give that a bit of a crimp, making sure that loop is about the same size as the loop on the first one. Make sure that you've got a really good hold on all 3 pieces of that threading material. What you're then able to do is, if there is any residue sticking out of the top from that single piece, fold it away from the crimp like so, and then just trim it flush. Now the reason I use the little clasp up at the top is because it gives me something to hold on to whilst I add that crimp cover. Now if you want to add the crimp cover on a little bit later, you can. I'm only going to show you one time because the way I use crimp covers is very different to how everybody else does it. So crimp and crimp cover in whatever fashion you see fit. I'm just going to pop that on. And if this isn't your preferred way, then that is fine. Do it your way. This is the way that I do it. I don't expect anybody to do it the same way. I just make sure that that little shell goes all the way around the crimp. And then I will use my chain nose pliers to close that up. You could use a magic crimp system. You could use your 2-step crimping pliers. It's absolutely up to you. This is my preferred method. And then once you have got that crimped and the crimp cover on, you can get rid of that little clasp out of the way. The next thing we're going to do is to just separate out the 3 wires. Now at this stage, it doesn't really matter what order they're in. We're just going to pull and make sure that they are separated. The outer 2 are going to need 2 of these little 3mm beads each, and the inner thread is only going to have 1, and this forms a triangle up at the top of the design, and it ensures that when we sit everything together, it ensures that that 3-hole spacer with those beautiful encrusted rhinestone style stones look really, really pretty and neat. So we need 2 on the outer side now, and you can use your little bead holder to ensure that these things don't fly away. So if you've got a little bead buddy or bead spring, then they're really handy for times like this. So if I just push that all up to the top, we're going to kind of nestle them together, and you can see it sort of builds a little pyramid. And that's what we want from this design. Let's just make sure that that is sitting sideways so it matches the first one. Then we're going to need to feed on our 3-hole spacer. So as I said, it doesn't really matter now which order they are in, but you do need to make sure that you've got the single bead going into the middle hole, and then that the outer 2 strands, both of them with 2 beads on, go through the outer holes, because when you push it all up to the top, you get this really neat little pyramid stack design. So I'm going to make my earrings symmetrically opposite, which means I'm checking that the rhinestone encrusted side of that little 3-hole spacer bar is upmost, and I've got my little triangle up at the top. Now on the first of my 3 threads, I've added 3 of those little 3mm spacer beads, and I'm going to add the smallest of my Czech glass beads. I add that on. And then to the middle one, I used 4 of those 3mm spacer beads and the medium size Czech glass. And then I added 5 and the largest of my 3 bead choices. So I'm also going to grab in one of those pieces of chain now. And as I said, these are around about 1 inch each. This is just some scrap chain I've had since the dawn of actual time. Going to grab in my little tube crimp now. And I've got my little bead buddy there. I don't know what they're called, bead spring, bead stopper, bead buddy, whichever way you want to think of it. I've just got it to hand to hold everything together because I am quite clumsy, let's face it. When I am going to be ready to finish the bottom of this little stack, I'm going to add on my little crimp tube. You could use a crimp round bead instead, but before I allow that to slide down, the holes in these beads are very generous and you might lose a crimp tube up inside. So what we're going to do is to put the link of the chain over the end of that beading threading material, and this is, as I said, the Beadalon 19 strand in satin gold. Then I'm going to softly curve that around and pop the end up inside that crimp tube like so, and just control the very end of that wire or that beading thread so that I can bring that all the way up to the bead, and in that way it's not possible for your little crimp tube to disappear inside that bead. Now we do want these to be enough space between the chain and the bead so that you can sit a crimp cover over the top of that crimp in a moment. So just take your time. You could, if you need to, just take your pliers to help you get that into the exact position that you want, and then when you're ready, give that a hearty squish, trying to keep the residue of that tail of threading material in a straight line. If you keep it in a straight line, what it means is it doesn't go off at a funny angle out the end of the crimp and make it difficult for you to then add a really smooth crimp cover. Once that is very firmly adhered, we're going to just slide that sideways and pull that threading material away. Bead stringing wire, I believe it's known as. and give it that a little bit of a sharp pull to one side. Once you've got a really strong angle, just like so, you can just hold that to one side, get in with your flush cutting pliers and trim that away very close to the outside of that closed up crimp tube. As I mentioned, because I've got a bit of a funny way of doing crimp covers, I'm not going to show you that again. Some people find it quite painful to watch, but that is indeed how I close my crimp covers. You can absolutely do that however you desire. So all I will do is repeat that process again and again until everything is sat together. And I've got my cascading graduated earrings, utilising that really pretty encrusted 3-hole spacer bar. Of course, you've got the stars of the show here, which is the beautiful Czech glass beads. I will just grab the little vernier and I can tell you what sizes they are. So the medium is an 8mm, the large is a 12mm, and the small I imagine is a 6mm. Let's check. It's a 6mm. There we go. So I hope that you have enjoyed that tutorial today to make your cascading earrings with Czech glass beads. This is Jem at Jessie James Beads. Have the most wonderful day. Bye for now.